One thing that I've noticed that is most helpful to reframe as a leader or as a manager, as a practitioner, is how you see what we call quote unquote resistance. So are there any Star Trek fans on the podcast?
Absolutely.
So there was one particular space species there called Borg, and then they were assimilating the other species, and they had this famous phrase, resistance is futile. This is the mentality many leaders, especially older school, bring, trying to manage resistance, to fight resistance. And it's not helpful to see it the way it is. Don't get me wrong. The energy of fear, of maybe of opposition or of the tension, it's real. So when something happens, quite often friction happens, tension happens, so people may feel resistance. However, it is important how we frame it. Rather than call that resistance and trying to fight resistors or bring them into the camp, think of it as a system response.
Hello, this is Beyond the Noise, the podcast for leaders and founders under pressure. This podcast is your pause. Walk away feeling clearer, lighter, and more confident in how you lead and live. My name is Khurshid Zainudinov. I'm the co-host of this podcast. I'm also a non-executive director and leadership coach.
And I am Anastasia Lynch. I'm a co-host of Beyond the Noise. I am ACC coach. I coach executives, leaders.
Our guest today is Sergey Helmar. Sergey is a change practitioner, mentor, and ICF PCC coach based in New Zealand. Welcome, Sergey.
Thank you, guys. It's a real pleasure and honor to be a part of this podcast. So I was really touched when Khurshid approached and asked me to be part of this conversation. And I really love the idea of Beyond the Noise. So thanks. I'm a change consultant. I'm a change coach. And as a change consultant, I've been working over the last 15 years or so, mostly across the New Zealand and Australian public sectors. I help organizations and leaders to implement change, to navigate the complexities of change, and most importantly, to build the internal capabilities to lead and manage change well. And as a change coach, I work with leaders all over the world to help them build and develop inner capacities and inner capabilities to lead change. And some of that is through frameworks and methods, like this is how you do that. A lot of that is actually the inner work, what I call inner work, that's helping leaders work on their mindsets, on their belief systems, on their shadows, on their parts, to integrate it all together and to lead the change inside out. I also was a member and a volunteer of the Change Management Institute for quite a few years. Change Management Institute is a world organization, so it's a professional organization for change practitioners, which helps change practitioners build credibility, capability, connections. So the work involved organizing lots of events locally here in Wellington, New Zealand, but also internationally, especially during COVID, helping change practitioners build connections and learn from other change practitioners all over the world.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining our podcast today, Sergey. And the topic for discussion is inner game of change. And it feels a bit surreal. If you don't mind, you have lots of experience with change in different capacities, right? You are a mentor, you're a change practitioner, you're also a coach. Can you tell us what are the main challenges that leaders face while their organization are undergoing changes?
That's a great question. And there is a variety of challenges that I have been observing like over all these years. There are some patterns and there's things that are quite unique to an organization. But if we zoom out just for a second, what I'm seeing is that there's a number of things. One is probably stating the obvious. We're all seeing that. It's the oversaturation with change. Change is the constant, and it's no longer you initiate something, then you make it happen, and then you move to business as usual. So in the older days, the role of a leader was to manage business as usual and then lead change. Now it's the paradox of having to do it at the same time. So there's no state of an organization where it's frozen, where change is completed. So one change finishes, another starts. Quite often they're overlapping. It creates a certain level of anxiety amongst the people. It creates a lot of overwhelm and it creates a lot of fatigue as well. It doesn't mean that organizations can slow down or stop because that's not an option. There is a lot of external drivers, political, economical, customer driven, which necessitate the changes. So now the question then becomes, how do you navigate that change complexity? How do you support your people organizations to lead the change, to navigate the change in a sustainable way? So that's one of the key challenges that I'm observing. And we brought up this topic of the inner game of change. What I'm discovering more and more that it becomes less about, for leaders, like using a proven methodology for leading change. It becomes more and more about the capacity to navigate change, about the resilience and their complexity fitness as well.
And Sergey, you have mentioned that in recent times, the speed of change have picked up. Could you identify any specific time since when it started to happen? Sort of, it was in what way for a long time? It was one set where the change was sort of measured and sort of fed slowly to people. Can you tell us anything that happened, any timelines that in which this all of a sudden changed?
I love your question, so Anastasia. And the irony of the question, or the answer, is that if we spoke to our ancestors 2,000 years ago, they would tell you exactly the same, that the speed of change and the amount of change around them is maybe overwhelming for many people. You might recall that old saying that, I think it was Chinese, it's like you don't want to live in the time of changes. The speed of change has always been there, like even like 100 years ago. It has increased exponentially, of course, over the last 10 years, post-COVID, with all the innovations, AI. What I'm also seeing is that it's not just the speed of change, it's the sheer number of those changes and the need for people to adapt and to absorb. It's just happening simultaneously at the same time for people, and which means that there is no solid ground. Quite often, it feels like there is no solid ground. So COVID, definitely our revolution, like AI revolution and other things, they have exponentially increased that. Even though, like, if you read books 10, 15 years ago about change in the business, so they were also talking about the VUCA world and then the increase of the speed of change. So I think it's happening, it has been happening, it will continue to happen. So there is real need for us and for leaders to find a way to be actually okay with that this is not going to change suddenly. We're not going to freeze it. But it's like, how do you navigate it despite the fact that it's happening? It's feeling that it's becoming more rapid and more rapid.
So what I'm hearing is change is not something new, but are leaders, from your experience, are they well equipped for such changes? If it has been happening for some time and they've been at the company for considerable number of years, what is something that you see? Are there any patterns or any themes that you have been observing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think in the past, a lot of mindsets and behaviors for leaders were okay, and you could be a capable leader, you could lead your organization through business as usual, a little bit of a change, without necessarily having to develop certain mindset and certain capacities. What I think is happening now, that's what I'm seeing a lot, is that it's like a spotlight. So suddenly there is no getting away. Suddenly there is no hiding. And if you, as a leader, have not been able or have not intentionally developed your a particular mindset, like a change navigator, that's what I called it, or certain capacities to lead change, then it becomes increasingly difficult for leaders. Let's face it, some people are more equipped and better with ambiguity and uncertainty, and it's just a natural way for them to navigate that complexity. But others, what I'm seeing a lot is there's a lot of technically capable leaders or who are used to managing things in a very predictable way. Like there is for example, a very defined part of the business, right? There's a workflow. So any changes that they encounter, like from within the organization outside, this is where it's starting to feel quite wobbly and quite unsettling for them. And what I'm also hearing, and what I also see, especially from my coaching clients, is that people are starting to ask, why is that happening and why are they? So it's like the external locus of control, rather than asking the question, okay, how might we do that? So that's probably one of the key shifts that I invite leaders to consider. There's no point in trying to understand the complexity of the world. So we should look around and scan around, but quite often it becomes a question of, okay, this is happening. Okay, what is actually happening? And how am I feeling around navigating that complexity? How might I do things differently? How might I support my team differently? What are the connections that I need to tap to? What are the factors and the impacts that I need to consider? So these are all the questions that are coming at the forefront. It is no longer business as usual, change. It's all kind of all enmeshed. So it's all one thing. And I think of a metaphor of a surfer, right? So these waves, they're there, but so you can drown or you can learn to actually surf that and ride those waves. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's vital.
That's a great description about what's happening, and I'm sure lots of people will be able to relate to that feeling you described, where things are changing. Maybe you're not equipped or you're not noticing them as much as other people. And then there's this resistance to, and this, sort of like offloading it to it's them. Something is wrong with them. Something is wrong with people around you. But actually, it could be most likely it's you they need to address first and find a coping mechanisms to, address new reality that we're living in right now, it seems. So if one was to find oneself in that situation where lots of change is happening, you're sort of aware that, you may not be coping as well. Is there something that a leader can notice that they're doing wrong? If they were to stop that one thing, everything that they're seeing around them would become just 1,000 times easier to deal with.
Yeah. I have an idea and I actually want to play with this idea with you. So feel free to jump in and join the conversation.
Absolutely.
One thing that I've noticed that is most helpful to reframe as a leader or as a manager, as a practitioner, is how you see what we call quote unquote resistance. So, are there any Star Trek fans on the podcast?
Absolutely.
Listeners maybe love Star Trek the way I do. So there was one particular space species there called Borg, and then they were assimilating the other species, and they had this famous phrase, resistance is futile. All right, so no resistance. And quite often I see this a lot. This is the mentality many leaders, especially older school, bring, trying to manage resistance, to fight resistance. And it's not helpful to see it the way it is. Don't get me wrong. The energy of fear, of maybe of opposition or of the tension, it's real, right? So when something happens, quite often friction happens, tension happens, so people may feel resistance. However, it is important how we frame it. So my invitation is, rather than call that resistance and trying to fight resistors or bring them into the camp, think of it as a system response. So people don't resist change. People are afraid of losing something quite often. So it's a shift in identity, a shift like there's a famous framework, a purpose, identity, mastery, right? So quite often we feel threatened to our identity feels threatened. Our level of mastery in the change what we know may become irrelevant. Purpose may shift. So people respond. So we all respond. Just if you're listening to this podcast, I invite you maybe to hit the pause button and just take a minute and think about the time when you were feeling tension or resistance to something. Like, what were the thoughts? What were the feelings going on for you? Right? So they're all legitimate. Now, if I call you a resistor and if I try to fight you, how will you feel about that? Now,
Even stronger, I imagine.
even stronger, yeah. So resistance, push and then push back. So my invitation is to acknowledge these forces are real. However, to look at them as a system response. What is these signals are actually telling us about the change maybe that we are designing, that we're implementing, and the tension, the friction points? What is actually signaling to us about what people might be fearful of or afraid of or unclear about? Is it just a knowledge thing? For example, I don't quite understand what it means. Is it maybe some sort of a perceived threat to an identity or to something else. Quite often people talk about like when let's say process or technology changes are implemented and some stakeholders might say, okay, it's not going to work because A, B, C, and D. So this is the first conversation. My invitation is to listen to the second conversation. What's actually underneath that? And quite often it's signaling to you that we're not feeling comfortable in this new world. So we don't see ourselves because we've been doing this for so much time. So I worked in a program where there was a huge change and transformation to quite an old system. And it was difficult for the people to see the new world because they've lived in the old world for so long. I'm not blaming them, right? So it's quite a shift. So it's quite a shift to define ways of working. So to sum it up, think of the resistance as a signal or as a system feedback and engineer in those practices where you can actually gather those insights and then get curious, okay, what might I mean and how might I help the stakeholders and the organization navigate this change quite differently?
So instead of resisting the resistance, what you're suggesting, Sergey, is to pause, look deeper, be more curious, and just stay maybe at the moment and ask questions.
It is that, yeah, for sure. It is that. So it's what I don't want the listeners to walk away with is an impression that it's all just about, like some soft stuff and then tree hugging. With human side, yeah, absolutely. Create some space. It's also being very intentional, knowing that this is the game. So this is not in the way. This is the way. This happens whenever people feel that there is a perceived threat to their identity, to something that they actually care about, right? Something that, what is this resistance response is telling you about what people are potentially protecting. So be intentional about that. Create practices and opportunities for people to engage, to ask questions, and know that initially there will be a lot of anxiety. There was that curve, right? So people will feel uncertain, but be okay with that. So it's actually part of the game. There are multiple practices like engagements. As a team leader, if there's an organizational change happening, for example, it is your role as a translator, as the mediator of that, and how you show up and then how you lead conversations is absolutely crucial. For example, I'll just give you an example. Very practical one. Let's say there's some organizational change happening and you are a leader or a manager. Bring in your team and then have a conversation, an honest conversation around 3 or 4 things. I've done it on Post-it notes. You can have it just as a conversation or otherwise. Ask a question and invite people to be very honest. What are you excited about this change? The second question, maybe the second set of Post-it notes is that, what are you concerned about? A third one, for instance, is what are you cynical about? Be okay with inviting this honest feedback so people may vent out. And then when it's like a pressure cooker, when the pressure is released, so there is suddenly space for something else. So be intentional with engineering these conversations, with engineering these experiences for people. And then once the pressure is released, continue to provide support. Is it knowledge? Is it something else? Is it some sort of changes to the way we're working? And invite people in the conversation. So it's not about the push, it's about the pull as well. So it's yin yang. Quite often, what I see leaders doing is they're trying to push things to the people. And this is what creates resistance, doesn't it? So how can you actually create that pull experience where people are feeling that they are leaning in, that they are being invited in the conversation, and be okay with the different opinions? So that's why diversity matters. So there are different opinions. It's how you work with them that matters.
Yeah, the last part that you said, I guess it has to be a genuine effort, not just letting people to, express their views, but also ability to listen and maybe do something about it, right? Because usually the change come from the top, and no matter what, you have to implement it. But what you are saying is, well, let's talk to the stakeholders. Let's listen to their concerns and maybe do something. And in your experience, have you encountered when certain change was coming, but then based on the response from the stakeholders, the way the changes happened were modified considerably?
That's a great question. So I don't know about considerably. However, what I have seen is that when we're all aware of the consultation mechanism when change is implemented, so for example, organizational change, so consultation is run. That's one mechanism to gather feedback and then actually modify some things, be it an org structure or some process. That's one thing. Second thing is maybe I'll take a step back about the change and then connect it with the previous part of the conversation about quote unquote resistance. Let's face it, quite often, not quite often, but every now and then, changes are not well thought through. So by design, something that is being implemented may not be the best option. In which case, it can be technology change. For example, a project or program team have not consulted enough with enough stakeholders, or there's a vendor, an external technology solution, so they're just bringing their solution. So when people are starting to see the solution, it's already too late to change it, right? So here's a classic situation where by design, something may be very difficult to accept. It may not have been well thought through, it doesn't fit the business. And this is the case where I actually don't blame people when they're feeling concerns, quote unquote, resistant. So where's that energy of opposition is coming through? Which brings a question about the systemically you design and implement changes, which is why design and then bringing the right people into the camp, the right people into the co-design conversation is absolutely crucial. So at the earliest start of that, yes, we can do 90 or 80% of that and then invite people and then listen for their feedback and try to change it. But quite often it's not practical and it's quite difficult. So the question then becomes is how do you elicit that feedback and actually create a environment where co-design generally happens with the people who are affected by change. So that's the question that I want to ask, right? How do you do that? And there are practices to do that. So there's a service design. So there is some design thinking, for example. So to sum it up, yes, sometimes change can be, or the direction of change can be changed at a later stage. However, it's much wiser to consider what we're doing and how we're doing at an early stage. It's like with anything, right? Like whatever you're building, let's say you're building your house.
Yeah,
It is too
spending
late.
more time on the planning phase.
Precisely, yeah. Yeah. So it's too late when your walls are up, when your roof is up. So it's too late to change the design. So that's why you want to spend a considerable amount of time working on the design, on the blueprint, and then agreeing things before, while also leaving room for the maneuvering. I'll probably say the last thing, like on that topic, which is it's great to have a plan. However, we are talking about complexity, right? And unpredictability. So no matter how good your plan is, engineering those feedback loops into like early on. So with some lead indicators, with some lag indicators, capture that feedback early on and pivot as you will, as you move forward. So that's actually a way to future-proof your design, to future-proof your change.
That's a great way of framing it, actually. At the same time, we didn't touch on the subject how quickly everything is changing. And from business perspective, the need and want for change and results is just as quick. And obviously now we just opened up the door of the longer you spend on planning, the better and more stable the transition and change is going to be. But what happens when we have this great, exciting idea and we need to do it now because everything is shifting and moving so fast around us? And next thing you know, our competitors are already ahead of us. How do you deal with that mentality? How do you manage that when you're a leader, let's say in the IT industry, and you have this constant demand from above to deliver a lot of change? Or do you then have to work more on yourself and work more on your softer skills of empathy and understanding other people? How do you see that? And maybe you have a great example from your practice as well.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing up this perspective, Anastasia. So that's quite topical. So there's a number of things that come into my mind. One is we can run very fast in the wrong direction, right? So it's absolutely important to understand what's happening, and this is the reality. So there's a lot of things happening, and unless we keep an eye on the patterns around us, on the trends, on what's actually emerging on the market and all the different forces. So there's a real risk to stay behind. So that's grounded. Now the question then becomes is that when we are working on a change or when we're engineering a solution, how can we balance the thinking, the planning bit with the kind of moving fast bit? And then some practices that come to mind is that, creating a minimum viable product or minimum lovable product and testing. So we all know in the world of marketing, so they go and they do like prototypes and the A/B testing to see how the market, how the system actually responds. I want to bring up an idea of some of the listeners might be familiar with Dave Snowden's Canadian framework. It's a mind-blowing concept and a framework which changed a few years ago when I first encountered that, how I think about work. It's Dave Snowden Canadian framework. And it's a sense-making model, and it helps you understand or assess what is your environment. And like one of the parts of that framework is the complexity. So in the simple world, you can have simple solution. In the complex world, so you don't know what you don't know. So what you do is you have some assumptions or hypotheses about what's happening, and then you initiate a response. You develop, let's say, a prototype, and then you sense how the system responds. So in the IT world, so we have a concept, we idea, we develop something, then we quickly test it through sprints, through quick iterations. Again, elicit feedback. So feedback from the system is the key word here, and strengthen or change our design accordingly and then move fast. Running parallel experiments is another example. So how might you run things in parallel, like maybe different squads of team at the same time, working on the same thing and then testing that out. That's another example. The main thing being here is that it's not about a rigid plan, it's about a fluid planning and then continuously gathering feedback from your system and strengthening the connections. So connection is another big theme in change. Quite often the issue is not in the parts, but often the issue is in how those parts are connected or not. So we are all aware of this problem of siloed thinking, or where dependencies are not managed well, which creates a lot of churn, a lot of overwork. So then the question becomes is what is the system that you want to set up that where people and then things are moving forward swiftly while staying connected at the same time? So that becomes a question, like how do you balance that?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you for great examples as well of that. That's very useful for people to hear. I wanted to add to that because obviously I'm sure on everybody's mind these days is this, I'll call it an insane urge to introduce AI into every single thing that you see around you. And I hear that a lot of people feel that's also part of change. Internally, it's internal change, but when internally a lot of work is being shifted towards AI, how do you manage the mood of the people where there will be fear, there will be resistance, and there will be a lot of unknown on how this is going to affect their work and their careers? Do you have any tips, any insights on that?
Recently, I was talking to someone and they said that unless you bring up the topic of AI in a conversation, you're so much pre-COVID. So it is it is one of the topics that
That's interesting.
pre-COVID. AI is like, look what has happened just over the last couple of years. So we are all anxious, curious, excited, maybe some people fearful at the same time. The way I look at it, it is a change. It's another change. And it's how do you harness this wave of change? Like, what do you actually make out of it? It is unique in a way. It is also not unique at the same time. So we've all seen some other revolutions, or the humankind has seen other revolutions where something is introduced and it changes the way things work. I don't think I will be super original here if I say that learn the skills, find the ways to make this your tool. Possibility of AI replacing some jobs, I think it's quite tangible. It is happening right now. However, it's also influencing how we do our jobs. AI does things much better, or becoming to do things much better, some things much better than humans do. So it's very difficult to compete with artificial intelligence with machine learning tools in certain ways, but we don't have to. we still have some very unique things, that AI is unlikely to replace in the foreseeable future. So that actually helps us to become more aware of us, who we are as human beings, and then lean into our unique things, like that emotional capacity, inner strength, connections. People want to talk to people. And that's what I'm, again, discovering in my coaching practice, for example. All right. So I know that in the coaching industry, for instance, a lot of organizations are starting to experiment with AI coaches, which is great, right? So it's like ChatGPT on steroids. However, I hear clients more and more saying me like, I actually want to talk to a human being because there is a very different kind of a quality. So which is true not just for the coaching industry. Like if you're a leader, people want to see you as a human being, as who you are. It's that energy of the presence. It's that energy of excitement and then opportunities that you can bring as a leader. So this is indispensable. No AI can change that. So AI is a tool. So I use it in my work as well, like for analyzing text, for example. But the human connection and the importance of being adept in that relational space becomes increasingly important for leaders all over the world. Because if we are to survive and thrive, this is, I think, where we need to learn the skills of AI. We also need to learn the skills of being even more human.
I guess similar disruptions happened in the past, like computers, internet, now AI. So obviously these are, parts of the change. Earlier, you mentioned that there is a need for taking a pause. And I'm putting myself in the shoes of a leader whose organization needs to change. And there are lots of pressure. I have to do so many things. And this change thing is additional pressure. Yet I have to pause. It doesn't seem very natural to pause during the time of change. What would you say to senior leaders? What would be a good thing to consider why pause is unavoidable during the time of change?
I'll probably start with one particular example or an observation. As a coach, probably every second person, and I'm not kidding, that I'm coaching, so they bring up the challenge of not having enough time as the number one challenge. Like, we don't have enough time. I don't have enough time. I have this and this and this. Yet it's exactly the same people at the end of the coaching conversation who are saying, look, I haven't actually realized how much I've needed those 60 minutes just to reflect. Now I see things more clearly. Now I see things differently. My invitation here to leaders is think of it as a strategic investment. If you're a leader, your role is to be on the balcony, not just on the dance floor, but on the balcony as well. When you're on the balcony, this is where you can start seeing patterns, what is working, what is not, what is actually happening, the connections, the disruptions. And this is where, so getting on the balcony, taking a pause and reflection, this is what actually helps you elevate the game. There was a famous book by Daniel Kahneman, Think Slow, Think Fast, where he talks about the two operating systems. So system 2, this is the reflective, slow thinking, which is absolutely crucial for us to engage to help our system 1, which is that fast thinking. So they are not the opposites. They're like two parts of the bicycle. So you need both parts of the bicycle to actually ride the bike, right? So think of it as a strategic investment, a way to de-risk your delivery, a way to de-risk your execution, a way to see things that you wouldn't see if you were just staying on the dance floor. And it doesn't have to be like something that's, so all calendars are busy, but it's quite often becomes about protecting the boundary, right? Being very intentional with booking. You can start with 15 minutes, right? Or maybe 1 hour per week, yourself with your team to think about the thinking. I'll give you an example. So just, I was in a program where there was a fast pace, there was a lot of things happening. However, what we did, we carved out 90 minutes as the team, quite intentionally think about what is actually happening, what we're seeing. So I'll share one practice, which you can do individually or with your team, for example. So 4 stations or 4 different sets of questions. So it's called a scene navigator. List all the things all the forces, what I call like wind in your sails. What are all the things that, let's take a project, for example, or your state of the business. Like, what are the things that are enabling your change, things that are contributing to the good flow of that change? Like, what are the forces that you can actually leverage? On the second A3, for example, in the second station, you can list all the things that are headwinds or anchors or rocks, like all the things that are potentially working against you. Again, this is system mapping, which is strategic work, which is leadership work. So what are the things that are potentially contributing to you not moving forward? What do you need to be mindful of? Wins in your sales, headwinds. The third question is the land unknown or terra incognita. What are the things that I don't know, or things that maybe my potentially blind spots or blind spots for our team, something that I really want to get curious about. And the fourth question is like with all these three things, right? How might I navigate this change? So you see, this is not about the content. This is about the next level. This is about what are you seeing or maybe not seeing or need to be seen to move forward. So this is the, again, investment, strategic investment into your capacity and capability to navigate this change well. And I'll give you a last example, which is about Formula One. They have those pit stops, don't they? And it's because they have those pit stops, those cars are actually able to continue the race, the laps. And then now imagine if they didn't have those ones. So it's a strategic investment, pausing, to get better, to move faster. And I know I said it will be the last one, but I'll probably quote Stephen Covey as well. This famous story of sharpening the saw when there are two people cutting the wood and then one just continuously goes, the other one stops and then sharpens his saw. And he produces better results because he makes those pauses and he sharpens his saw to have sharper tools.
So it's about,
Makes
just to
perfect
sum it up.
sense.
Yeah, and it does because, unless someone is intentional, whether you call it pause or strategic investment, unless you're intentional, you might end up just rushing things, making so many mistakes and going in the wrong direction. And thank you for sharing these practical tips. I think especially the lingo that you use is going to be very much familiar for the leaders who are listening to us.
Yes, it was great to the practical tips I think will be very much appreciated as anybody can carve out a 60 minutes or 90 minutes with a team and try it out. It doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, and I can share one more practice. I find it quite useful for leaders. It doesn't take a long time. Next time you have your team meeting or project meeting or like with your division meeting, just ask 3 questions. Who else, conflicts, and the ripple effect? So who else, you're looking at your initiative, for example, like who else, who are the stakeholders that we may not have considered that we need to consider, who might be potentially affected or need to be involved in whatever we're doing. And once you do that, run it again. Okay, who else might we have missed? So first one is about the who else. Second one is about conflicts. Whatever we're doing, what kind of tensions might this be creating? Are we contradicting some other maybe projects or initiatives? Are we running counter to some other division's goals or KPIs? Are we disrupting anything? Like, what are the potential tension points and the conflicts? And the third one is like, what's the ripple effect? Like, whatever we're implementing, there are certain impacts. Once you analyze those impacts, ask another questions. Okay, if that happens, what else may happen? The second one. And then what's the next ripple? If that happens, what else may happen? So do that scan of the environment. So you see there's a connecting theme here. It's always about kind of doing whatever we're doing, but scanning the environment at the same time for the response, seeing like where are the connections or disruptions, what's the ripple effect, what are the impacts. So in my opinion, this is what actually helps leaders be able to navigate the complexity much better with more agility, with more attunement, rather than just following a rigid plan.
Sergey, you worked with so many leaders as a coach, mentor, and change consultant, change practitioner. Do you remember any vivid examples of someone who surprised you maybe with his approach, that something that you learned from him, not he learned from you? Any tips you would like to share with our listeners?
What comes to mind is that an example of a leader who was under immense pressure, and yet they had this capacity to, at the same time, be vulnerable, like this is what I'm going through, but also show and demonstrate immense trust in their team. And I could feel it. So earlier we spoke about that human component, right? That empathy and that human operating system. So, and I could feel it so tangibly that I was under pressure as well, working with that leader. Yet, and quite often you may have doubts, okay, am I doing the right thing? And then what if I do a wrong thing? Very human stuff, right? But I could feel that leader had trust in me and in the rest of the team. And I'm not saying it surprised me, but it was just such a tangible experience that allowed me and other team members to actually lean into their potential when there's a safe environment, safe and trusted environment. Suddenly you have access to those resources that inner resources that you thought you didn't have, and it actually opens some possibilities. So that was, for me, it was a real example, quite an inspiring one, of how under pressure, rather than putting pressure, and I'm not saying don't put pressure, don't challenge your team members or your team, but what I'm saying is that you can do it in a different way. So there's pressure, but also they support at the same time. And that's what makes a difference. That's what makes absolute difference.
Yeah, this is amazing. Remaining a human being under the pressure. Yeah. Thank you so much
Yeah, I
for
think that's
sharing this example.
that's the best thing that leader can do, and that's a great example. I think especially that it's a life example, it's not a theory of how things should be, but seeing it in practice when people are alive, they're in front of you, and they are human, but they're making these right decisions for themselves and for their team. It's always beautiful to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, it's like for those who are listening or watching this recording, again, I actually invite you to hit the pause button now and spend a minute or two thinking about two examples. One is the time when you had that kind of experience where a leader was accommodating and you could feel the trust, and then how that actually affected you. And think of the opposite example when you might have been working with someone who was just putting pressure on you, and again, how that affected you and the team. So I'm a strong believer in the kind of connecting to real life examples. So rather than me sharing that, so again, just have a think of your own experience and see what comes up for you and see what you notice and the difference and the lessons that might be useful from that.
While you were talking, I already had, two examples linked in my head, and the feeling is completely striking. I think you can learn quite a lot from just the feeling that you'll remember from those experiences. That's great. Thank you so much,
Can we build
Sergey.
on that? So you don't have to share any details, Anastasia, but what's coming up for you as you are thinking of those examples?
I think it's the striking difference and the impact that it has on the state of mind, on energy levels, on even the results, which were there. But at the same time, if you look at the negative example, when you had something that was lots of pressure, no human connection, even the results that delivered didn't feel like they were good enough, that they were actually tangible. It's almost like you're putting all the energy out and get nothing back. That's probably how I would describe it. Versus the other way, when you're looking at somebody who is supportive but still leading in that position, every little step feels like a little bit that you added contributed to the team, and that feels always great to be of service to your team and to the project.
Yeah. I love it how you describe it. And then just again, so we're noticing it's about energy exchange as well. So, and which is absolutely crucial and again, in a complex and a fast moving system, how aligned a system is and then how the energy is exchanged. Think of the human body, for example. So it matters how things are aligned, how energy flows in our bodies and our minds. So if we're feeling stuck somewhere, so it's hard, but it's when it's aligned, when the energy flows, it's a very different experience. Or our organizational construct is no different. A team is no different. So it's more than
It's a living
it's
mechanism, isn't it? It's
living
a living thing.
living system. Exactly.
I wanted to thank Sergey for sharing your practical advice and your experience with us and our listeners. And it's amazing because you bring wealth of experience. You've seen so many changes that, typical person probably doesn't see the number of changes that you have experienced, Sergey. And for our listeners who want to get in touch with Sergey, either in his capacity as a change practitioner or coach or mentor, we will put Sergey's details in the podcast episode information so that the people can reach you and get advantage of all that experience that you shared with us.
Thank you, teams. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of the thoughts that have been maybe in my head for quite a while and to share them with the wider audience. So thank you.
It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and it was great to hear your insights. And we'll, as always, invite everybody who's listening to follow you on LinkedIn to hear any more of the insights and ideas that hopefully you'll be sharing there too. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sergey.
Thank you, team.